get ready for our next speaker, which is Brocato from Macaroo.
Oh, there we go.
Cool. Here we are.
Okay. So
nice
just let me know.
rig, by the way.
Oh, oh yeah. Well, it's pretty fun. I have like a full, well, a half Marshall stack in a very small office, but I make do. I have my priorities.
Okay. So are you ready to take it away?
Yeah, sure. I'll take it away. Okay, so this is actually a very good fortuitous scheduling here, because my talk is somewhat similar, if not maybe a little bit smaller in scope, to Igor's, in that I'm going to talk about porting features from Ruby to Crystal, primarily to get speed benefits. So hey everybody, I'm Mark Brocato. I'm the creator of two apps that you might have used, especially if you're a developer, which most of you are. One is Macaroo, and the other one is the new one, which my talk is really going to focus on, which is flatbase. So this talk's primarily going to focus on my experience learning and using Crystal to solve a real and fairly urgent problem in production. So why did I decide to use it in the first place, and what benefits did I get? So I'll give you a little bit background on me, the problem I was trying to solve, what it was like taking the plunge and actually deciding to use Crystal and learning it, and then some actual results in how it turned out quantitatively. So my background, I've been in software development for a long time, just approaching 20 years, primarily JavaScript, Ruby, and a decade plus of Java a while ago, although I haven't touched that in a little while. And I'm kind of ashamed to say that up until a few months ago, I never actually shipped a compiled binary in my entire 20-year career. I think I started right at the time where you know, it was Java instead of C++. So I only compiled stuff when I was in school, never professionally. So you might know me from a site called macaroo.com, which is, it's a test data generator. It helps you generate realistic but entirely fake data for software testing and demos. And it's primarily used by developers, testers, and sales engineers trying to sell or demo software. And recently I launched a new app where I actually use Crystal, and this is flatbase.io. So if you're a developer and you know SQL and you have some CSV or JSON files that you need to do some data science on, some querying and charting, and you feel more comfortable with SQL than you do learning, you know, like a Spotfire or a Tableau or any of these other tools, then Flatbase is the right tool for you. Basically, you just drag and drop CSV or other flat files, JSON files into the web browser, and you have a database instantly, and you can just start querying away and charting things. So to give you an idea of the context here, this is, oops, hold on, let me go back. I'll show you a little bit of the app. Okay. So basically, when you come to Flatbase, you have a new workspace, and then you can drag and drop files from your local hard drive, CSV files or JSON files, into the app, and you upload them, and it figures out the types, and you have like tables immediately. And then you can go about writing queries, charting, sharing the results with coworkers. It's meant to be like an enabling data science platform for people that just feel comfortable with SQL and don't want to learn, like a Tableau or something like that. So what I want to focus on is this first part of the process, which is uploading the files. So dragging them into the browser and then having the backend figure out what types these things are. So this whole app is built on the latest Rails 6, and including the part of the code where I figure out what the type of every column in the CSV file is. And so here's basically the process of how it works underneath the hood. So determining the data types, once you upload a file, first thing I do is sanitize it with a great library called hippiecsv, which is actually made by the folks at Intercom, the little chat widget. Basically, like, I don't know what programs out there are generating CSV, but they generate a lot of really messed up files, like with different line endings on different lines, strange encodings and like byte order markings, and just like every horror show you can imagine winds up being in a CSV file. So hippiecsv is not a very fast library, but it is a very flexible and very lax parser for CSV. So it basically can swallow like any garbage you give to it and come out pretty seamless. So after I've sanitized the file, I loop through it with Ruby's CSV.for each. And I test if each value can be parsed as a date or a number. I keep track of the numeric scale, precision, and as well as the length of the string. And then I use all that information after I've gone through the whole file to generate a create table SQL statement. Nothing particularly spectacular. I just have to process through the whole file and write a bunch of if statements. So in Ruby, this took, for a file that was 100,000 rows and 6 columns, about 24 seconds, which is really ouch, especially since I'm enabling you to drag and drop multiple files at once. You can wind up waiting for a minute with the browser really doing nothing other than showing the spinner. So that was a real bummer. And I know that probably hippiecsv is contributing quite a bit to that, but I can't really live without it because Ruby's CSV parser just isn't quite lax enough to handle like real world messy data. So I had looked at Crystal like a few years ago when it was very new. So I was familiar with the fact that it existed and it was basically Ruby syntax, but that's about all I knew. But I kind of needed help. I needed something that would just be a silver bullet and make this darn thing faster. So I decided to try rewriting just the data type detection in Crystal. And I wanted to make it like kind of really boneheaded and easy to call from my Ruby app. So I literally just decided to make a command line app called extract types that I would call, as a command line execution from the Rails code. So you pass it the file, you pass it the delimiter, and it would spit out a JSON summary of what's in the file with all the data types and columns. So this was when I really started learning Crystal, and it was a very condensed and fairly easy process. So getting up and running was as simple as just running brew Crystal on Mac OS. First thing I had to learn was how to receive command line arguments. And not to go into this in too much depth, but what I liked as a Ruby developer is like it felt the same as Ruby in terms of its terseness, its like clearness, very easy to read the code. Like code does a lot for you in a few lines. It just felt like a native experience as a Ruby developer. So I didn't feel any kind of friction like I would with another language. So I wrote an option parser to get the command line arguments. And then started parsing the CSV, which is like almost the same as basically doing it in Ruby. It's like slightly different class names, but the same basic pattern, same library name. So it felt very native. What was the first thing that was a little bit different was actually having to deal with types. So I created a class to represent a column with name and data type and length, etc. And needed to figure out how to like make properties that were readable and writable like you would with attribute accessor in Ruby. So Crystal has this property type that basically is like attribute accessor. And one of the neat things I found is that in constructors in Crystal, you can just put the little @ symbol on any of the parameters and it automatically assigns those to the properties on the class. So it was kind of nice that like Crystal actually had something that was slicker than Ruby does. So I was charmed. Outputting the JSON, very similar to Ruby, like requiring a JSON library, including a module, JSON serializable, and it just basically made my class like automatically output to JSON. It's really, really nice. And then the rest of it, was like fairly similar, like creating an array. The only difference was you have to say what type of thing goes in the array. But as far as adding to the array, it's that same like left shift operator. Calling a method on a module is the same. So I didn't really have to learn that much. It was more about just learning the type system and following the compiler errors. But I felt my progress was pretty quick as a person that wasn't making a serious study of Crystal, just trying to do something with my Ruby knowledge to make my app faster. Then I had to compile the executable. Crystal allows you to do this from the command line. You can use this -- release option to basically do the fast version of your app, the production version. So it takes a few extra seconds to compile, but what it builds is something that's the best possible performance. And then set about writing the code in Ruby to call that executable. So basically, I just get this JSON description of all the types in an uploaded file. It was like basically the same format I was already using in my Ruby implementation of this logic. And so more or less like I just swapped out a call to a method to this call to a command line program. And I suppose I could have made like a Crystal microservice or something, but I just wanted to be like as simple and as quick as possible. So just calling it from the command line was a good choice. And so, to recap, like what the actual performance difference I saw was, remember in Ruby, it was 24 seconds for 100,000 rows and 6 columns. And in Crystal, It's ridiculous. It was 0.3 seconds for the same thing, like doing the exact same operation. And one thing that really surprised me, which was an awesome win, was that I didn't need like a special hippiecsv library to make Crystal's CSV parser more resilient to, messy data. It just like naturally is more resilient to some of the problems I was seeing with the Ruby library. Especially like different line endings, which seems like a thing that should never happen, but it happens quite often. So that was like a huge win that, I was really worried that, yeah, it would be faster, but then it wouldn't work for many users. But that wasn't the case at all. It basically gave me the same resiliency that hippiecsv did. So super appreciative of that. So from start to finish, all told, this took me like a morning, basically, being a fairly experienced Ruby developer and just kind of following my nose through the documentation and not really trying to make a serious study of anything, but just, trying to make it work. It was a really good experience, and it really, intrigued me for, using it further in the future. Now, this was like 3 or 4 months ago, and on a totally unrelated effort, I started using Rust quite a bit heavily. And so I thought it's worthwhile to make a comparison with Rust because they're both fast compiled languages, and people might be cross-shopping them if they want to make something that's like systems programming or optimized for speed. I'll say that in my opinion, at least with my background of being like a JavaScript and a Ruby developer, Rust is much harder to learn unless I think your background is like C or C++ or some other systems language. Like maybe a Go background would make it easier to learn. But Rust has a pretty different way of approaching things, and it's got a very strict compiler, which is something that many people love about it. I actually really love Rust for totally different reasons, by the way, so I don't want to make it seem like I'm bashing it. But honestly, as a Rust beginner, when I was first starting Rust, I think this would have taken me like several days to accomplish what I accomplished with Crystal in a few hours. I would have been fighting with the tooling and the compiler and just the cognitive dissonance of a totally new paradigm with Rust for a few days, I think, before I'd actually have something that I could use in production. And Rust has some of the same problems of an early language that Crystal does. It's maybe a little further along, but it doesn't have a proper AWS SDK either, which is a problem I recently ran into. The biggest difference that isn't really a matter of opinion, but a hard fact that probably differentiates why you choose one versus the other, is that Crystal has garbage collection and Rust doesn't have garbage collection, which is both comedy and tragedy. It's like garbage collection is very convenient. It prevents you from mishandling memory, but if you work with garbage collected languages, you know that garbage collectors just stop everything when they need to run. So it makes your program not have very consistent performance. And for some, they never notice that. If you're not building a high frequency trading app, maybe you don't care about that. But if you need that performance, then Rust or C++ is the go-to there. So in summary, I would definitely recommend taking a look at Crystal if you're a Ruby developer. And I think a great place to start is just if you've got computationally intensive parts of your app that you need to be fast, why not just pull that code out of Ruby and port it to Crystal? You can see the kind of results that I got. 25 seconds to basically 0.25 seconds was a 100-fold increase in performance. So I think that's a great place to start. And I'm really hopeful that this is a niche that Crystal can kind of grab a foothold in to become more popular. Because I would love to use Crystal on a lot of projects in the future where I really need speed. I find it to just be so convenient and so pleasurable to work with that I'm really rooting for it. So thank you, everybody. That's the end of my talk. If you'd like to follow up with me, I'm on Twitter at macaroodev. And if you'd like to try the apps, either macaroo.com, which is the one that most people use, or the new one, flatbaseio, which is what I was talking about in this talk. So thanks, everyone, and I'll take any questions that are there.
All right, Mark, thank you very much. That was super interesting. We sparked quite a conversation here. I don't know if we have time for all the questions, but I'll just pick a couple, and if we make it, we make it, and if not, we follow over on Discord. Sanks says, do you think Rust makes you more confident in your code, or is Crystal good enough?
That is the chief benefit of Rust, is it makes you very confident in your code. It's kind of a harrowing experience getting your code to compile. The compile checker is brutal, but it forces you to consider every possible error case. So if I was writing something that was like just truly mission critical and, you know, a lot of pressure was on me to have a highly available system that's super safe, Rust is a really good option for that. You really feel like it's got your back. That's not a priority with Crystal, at least I don't think. So it depends on what you're looking for. If you're really worried about you know, reliability and having a language that forces you to write safe code, Rust is optimal. If you want to be productive and get the same performance as Rust, Crystal is a great option. And I think Crystal will have a much wider appeal. It's just easier to learn and just more pleasant to learn, I think, than Rust, which is very challenging, but rewarding as well.
All right. And Jason asks if you ran into any problems with Crystal while doing the port that took you some time to work through it.
I actually didn't. Like, truthfully, I really didn't. Figuring out like how to compile stuff was pretty easy. I didn't run into any problems with the documentation. The compiler errors I got were pretty straightforward. Now, my use case was pretty confined. Like, I didn't have to use a framework. I wasn't building a web app. I was just building essentially a command line tool. But my experience this time around was pretty good. I think a few years ago, there were some stumbling blocks. It was difficult to figure some things out. But I came back to it fresh, like literally 3 or 4 months ago, and I didn't have any issues at all. So it was a great experience.
Okay, and an anonymous attendee asked if Crystal is used in production of flatbaseio already. Yeah,
it's in production. I literally like wrote the first line of Crystal code and then maybe 8 hours later shipped it to production, which is when both of these projects are my solo projects. So when you're a company of one, you get to do things like that without having to, you know, beg for forgiveness or ask for permission. But yeah, and to be honest, like it was one of the least problematic parts of the application. It was very robust, surprisingly for something that's 1.0. So yeah, it went in production right away and it's been doing great.
Right. That sounds super great. Thank you so much, Mark. I'm looking forward to hearing you again, maybe next time playing one of your guitars. And we can switch over to Discord to follow up on some questions. I feel like community has a bunch of things to keep asking from you.